Welcome you all here this morning. Our broadcast live, well, it's not quite live, it's recorded to be sent out. To welcome particularly those people who are citizens or ex-citizens of the Crescent. A few of you here, good to see you all here. One man in England who's waiting for this talk to go online, of course, is Jerry McConnell, whom you would all know. And if he's listening, we send best wishes from everybody here. Now, I thought maybe I'd put a photograph of Jerry up on the screen. So I went to his Facebook page, but every single photograph of him on Facebook, he's wearing a Tottenham Hotspur jersey. So I decided I'm not putting a Tottenham Hotspur jersey up on my page book. So best wishes, Jerry, if you are listening in. History of the Crescent, just a very quick, before I start, to how the Crescent came to be first and how the town. The Crescent, of course, is outside the town. It's in the country. And at one stage, the boundary of the town, as you went up the hill, stopped at the railway station. So the hospital was outside the town, the convent was outside the town, and they were all country areas. And what happened in country areas around the town, Crescent, of course, is there 75 years next month when they all started moving in December of 1949. And it's been a very powerful community for the last 75 years. Of the 71 houses, Charlie had worked it out yesterday, 15 families who were there from the start have still got other descendants who are still living in the same houses, 15 of the 71. It's about 20%, which is a good figure. The town itself started in the early 1600s, and of course the people who came here were English. And you all recognise that. And just to give a quick phrase about what the Crescent field and how it developed. The English who came first, of course, very few of them. There's only a small number living in a little village where the Hope Castle is. And they needed food. And of course, they didn't have enough to herd large herds of cattle or anything like that. And the one thing, of course, that the English Normans brought into our country were rabbits. Okay? And they used rabbits as a very quick source of food. Now, the Normans came originally from France, invaded England, and then invaded Ireland. Of course, they spoke French. And the French word for a rabbit was coney, or a Norman French word. And even today, quite a lot of people in England still refer to rabbits as conies. So the conies were brought into Castleblayney. Irish people then didn't know what a rabbit was and didn't have a name for them, so we took the word coney and we changed it into Cyneen, which is the Irish for a rabbit, okay? And the rabbit burrow in Castleblayney, where all the rabbits were brought into, was this hill, which is on that side of us, overlooking us, okay? And so it became known as the rabbit burrow, right, which you would then refer to as Coney Burrow, which of course becomes Connabury. And Connabury isn't an Irish word at all, even though people try to translate it into Irish. It's two English words. It means a rabbit burrow. And that was, now once the rabbits got in, of course, there was no stopping them, right? Now, another place which was very important outside the town, this you will know as Dick Adair's on the Dundalk Road. The field to the left, where all those bushes are, I don't know how many acres is in it, but it's still a huge field of bushes today. There's no houses. Paddy Bogue's house is a bit further nearer the town. And it's just on the edge of the town estate, okay, Lord Blaney's estate. And Lord Blaney took that field, the one to the left, and broke it up into turf banks. You all know what a turf bank is. And all the business people in the town rented and paid him money for a turf bank. And they sent their workers out and sent their children out. And every summer they would cut turf of all these turf banks and then bring them into the town, because there was nothing else apart from chopping down Lord Blaney's beech trees off the Black Island, was to keep them cutting down trees, that they had turf for their fires. And the businessmen in the town sold turf on, of course, till the railway came, in which case coal then comes, and then everybody's burning coal in their houses and not turf. But all the turf banks were here, and all of this is outside the town boundaries, okay? Not in the middle of the town. And so the townland of Morahi, where the Crescent is outside the town boundary. And it's up the Mile Hill Road. So if you're in the middle of the town, and you're a businessman, right, you have a horse. Possibly at the back of your house you have a couple of cows, but certainly you're keeping animals. You need food. You need potatoes. You need oats to feed your cattle. And of course, you grow a lot of grass to cut hay off a field to feed your cows during the winter. So where did the businessmen grow their oats? Now, the boy living in that house across the street doesn't have much room at the back to be planting oats or planting a field of potatoes. And so what people in towns did was they rented land just outside the town boundaries. They had to be outside the town boundaries. And Morahi, where the Crescent is today, became the field that people in the town rented small pieces of, maybe 2 acres, 3 acres, 4 acres. And they would keep a couple of cows on the fields, the couple of fields they had. They would grow maybe a half an acre of potatoes, they'd grow oats, and in particular they would grow hay, and work it as if they were farmers. And every morning they would send either one of their labourers or one of their children out to milk the cows and bring in milk, so you had milk. They could grow hay, which they could take off every summer, and then they'd feed for their cattle during the winter. They would grow maybe an acre of oats if they would do that. And if they were keeping a horse in town, they had oats. Because there weren't that many shops in the town, there wasn't that much food. People had to provide for themselves. And Morahi, in many ways, was the food basket, or if you like, the people of the town. Now, there's one big house only in the townland of Morahi, and that's the one today that Mel Riley lives in, you know, at the Ballybay Cross. And that was built by a man called Edward McCardle. And Edward McCardle had a pub. His father, first of all, had a pub or a bar where Terry, my sister, lived in the square here. And eventually his son Edward became a very, very important Catholic businessman in the town. He owned Tavi's pub. He owned many properties in the town. He was also one of the first 3 trustees on the Catholic Church. When the Catholic Church was bought in 1803, Edward McCardle signed for it a 999-year lease. So the Catholic Church has only got 999 years up there. There's only 709 years left up there. But Edward McCardle was a very important businessman. And he in many ways managed the townland of Morahi and gave little farms to people who wanted to keep a couple of cattle, wanted to grow a bit of oats, maybe wanted to plant a bit of potatoes. Because before the railway came, it was very hard to get food into the town. You had to grow your own food. You had to provide your own food. Now, this is a list of the people who owned bits and pieces of the Crescent field in about 1830. And if you look here, you'll see the first one at the top here is Edward McCardle. And he's built the house, what we call Mel Riley's, what I would have called McKeown's, wasn't it, originally? But McKeown's built the modern houses there. Edward McCardle built the original house there, and that was his farm, that's where he lived. And you'll see down a number of men, all of whom are business people in the town, and none of them lived in Morahi. They lived in shops in the town and sent their children out every morning to look after them. They kept cattle out there. It was like a little out farm from the town. And it was useful because it's outside the town boundary. The town boundary stops at the railway station. By the middle of the 1800s, the people who owned the lands in Morahi, and you'll notice if you go down the right-hand column, there's very, very few houses, right? It's all land, 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 land. In other words, they've got 2 or 3 or 4 fields, but they don't have a house. They're living in the town. Now, the people I know on this list, the man at the very bottom of it, James Heenan, was a butcher who lived roughly where Mallon's have their butcher shop today. He was a butcher. Thomas Sheridan, above that, had a pub in the town, which later became Carrahurst pub in the main street. So he lived in the pub in the town. Joseph McMorran lived in the house in this side of the main street, which was Riley's, the vets, you know, the one beside the Bank of Ireland. That's where the McMorrans lived. Hugh Swansea lived here in the square, right? So he had very little land at the back of his house. And the rest of the list contains James Mooney. Now, James lived in Noel McGuigan's shop down Mucknell Street, you know, and John McGuigan's shop. And he had a pub, and he had the coach, which went to Armagh every morning and came back from Armagh every evening. So he was a coach, Wells Fargo sort of, he was a coachman. James Kirk, who's on the list, had a pub over here at Beatty's Corner. Now, he had no land at the back of that house to grow oats or grow potatoes or anything, so he's got 2 or 3 acres up where the Crescent is as well. John Ralston was where Mulligan's are today, and Parker and James McWatty, the 2 brothers, lived where the credit union is today. So all of these people are living in the town, working in the town, running businesses in the town, but they're using these little bits of farms, right? Now, I know even as late as the early 1900s, my granny tried to buy a field for us just above the crossroads at the Mile Hill Road, just behind where Lynch's house is there on the corner. And she bid up to £150 for a field up there, and she was outbid by a Presbyterian minister, a Reverend Galt from McKelvey's Grove, and the field became known as Galt's Field. My granny didn't get it, right? You'll also see at the bottom of this list that the Union Workhouse is in the same town land, and then eventually, of course, the Dundalk and Enniskillen Railway is built at the bottom of the hill. Eventually now the Urban Council moves up, right, to include the hospital, and eventually then to include the Crescent. I don't know where the limit is for the Urban Council today. It must run out to near the bypass, does it? Wherever the speed limit is out that road. The Urban Council area has gotten bigger and bigger as people moved on and on. But Morahi itself never had, apart from the McArdles who lived down in McKeown's house down at the Ballybay Cross, there were no permanent farmers in Morahi. It was like a piece added on to the town that the people in the town grew their stuff in. This is the maps from the 1800s, and you can see, of course, that the new railway line to Ballybay was cut right through Morahi, and it comes through Morahi. The field here at the bottom, number 15, which was James Kirk, who had the pub across the street here, he had that field. That's where the Crescent is today, okay? These couple of fields here. I think 16 maybe is where the Crescent Hill, a very unimaginative name for a housing estate, and you think they could have thought of something different. But anyway, the Crescent, that's the wall of the workhouse, as it's called, in this St Mary's Hospital, and the Crescent then is, as you know, next door to that. And that's the field that the Urban Council picked when they decided they were going to build a major housing project in the town. Okay? Now the field itself, before it was used in the 1920s and 1930s, was owned by James Carraher, that's Elizabeth's grandfather, is he? Grandfather, and it was known as Carraher's Field. And it was one of the fields that the Fogs used as a football field for quite a number of years in the 1920s. And quite a lot of big games, football matches, were played in the field where the Crescent is today, right? Carraher then one year put the rent on the field up from £10 to £100, so the Fogs decided to move out to Conquer Wood, to conquer out the Dundalk Road, and left James Carraher's Field. So that was Carraher's Field eventually, and then from there it comes into the Urban Council and then becomes development. We were still looking for who had designed or who the contractor was. Does anyone know who the contractor? You found it, Charlie, no?
From Dundalk.
They're from Dundalk, who?
Yeah. I think it was
McDonald's from Dundalk, right? We know it cost, I think, £110,000 to build the 71 houses, which is about £1,500 a house, which wasn't bad for the time, okay? Now, as soon as the houses were being built, it starts. So, these are the lists just very quickly of the people who lived in the workhouse in Morahi about 1910 to 1911. These were the nurses, the maids, and of course John Duffy, who was the master of the workhouse. He was in charge of it all, and they were the people who worked. And on the 1911 census, it gives a massive list of the patients in the hospital. That's the opposite. Here they are here. And one thing you notice in the last column, that all the people nearly who are in the hospital are either labourers or female domestic servants who can no longer work and are in the hospital. And when you look at the ages and you go down, you see 91, 94, 80, 76, 72. Just people who had no land, who had no families, nothing, and they end up in the workhouse. Now, there are some younger ones, of course, because there was a fever hospital in the in the grounds, and children who had contagious diseases like smallpox or like chickenpox and measles and things like that were sent up there away from their families till they got a cure. And of course, quite a number of the young girls in it were pregnant, but they were the patients in the hospital. And someday somebody can go through a list of these and see where they all come from. A lot of them you see from County Armagh, because the area covered South Armagh as well as Monaghan, but most of them are Monaghan, and others by there we see Mick Fitzgerald from Roscommon. Eventually then they built 71 houses in a look. Sorry? Showed what?
You can't see the whole page,
It's your shoulder.
your shadow is covering.
Oh, sorry. Am I okay now?
Yeah.
Right, sorry. I had a complaint before, getting in the way. No, if there's any problem, do stop me.
Another wee bit.
Right. And there was a huge controversy over what the place would be called, right? And the Urban Council had 2 or 3 quite heated meetings. One of them, I think it is Jerry Atkinson maybe, who suggested it should be called Eviction Terrace. Because the rents were so high, the people were going to be evicted on a regular basis. And that was a joke, by the way. They eventually come down, and Benny Malone, Jimmy Livingston, who was on the Urban Council, suggests it be called O'Duffy Terrace, after the general owner of Duffy. Now this, of course, caused controversy, because the chairman of the Urban Council at the time was Senator J.J. Brennan, who was on the other side in the Civil War, and he didn't want O'Duffy's name attached to it. So it becomes a great controversy. Benny Malone supports the idea, Benny of course being good blue shirt, supports the idea it should be called O'Duffy Terrace, and they talk on for a number of meetings about what it's going to be called. Now the Fianna Fáilers on the council, one of them, Mickey Doherty, suggests it be called Fatima Terrace, because at the same year the new chapel was being built in the convent, and the chapel in the convent is known as the chapel of Our Lady of Fatima, and so calling it Fatima Terrace would be a good name as well. And it causes all sorts of problems as to what they're going to call it. So the meeting gets postponed, and they decide to postpone it to a later meeting, and they'd have a discussion on what they were going to call it. You see as well in this page arguments that the rents are much too high. And it says here that the scheme would cost in the neighbourhood of £110,000, and on that basis the rents of the houses were going to be increased further. There were approximately 16 shillings a week, and some of them 14 shillings and 4 pence a week. And what was very interesting here is that anyone who came from a house in the town that had been condemned as not fit to live in got a cheaper rent than the other people got. So that was why some paid 16 shillings a week and some only paid 14 shillings a week if they came from a condemned house. And quite a number, particularly the 10 or 12 houses down the far side of Henry Street, were all condemned. They've all gone now, there's none of them left. And that caused consternation as well. So now O'Duffy caused trouble, and John J. Brannan goes on and he makes sort of comments here. I'm sorry you didn't know it. He wanted to adjourn the decision of calling it O'Duffy Terrace. No man ever caused so much conflict than the man whose name is mentioned here tonight. There was no man in Irish history who caused so much trouble and sorrow to the Irish people. It was my privilege to be a member of the army to which he belonged, but later on he goes on to say, O'Duffy was responsible for the execution of men who stood for the principles that the party was based on. So he's Fianna Fáiler, and he doesn't want O'Duffy's name attached to the terrace. This is the remnant, of course, of the Civil War and so on. They eventually go and they vote, and it's called O'Duffy Terrace. And 4 men, Jimmy Livingston, Benny Malone, Jimmy Mooney, and Gagan, that's Benny Gagan of the Centre for Tel, vote for the O'Duffy Terrace, and Mickey Doherty and Eddie McElroy and J.J. Brennan vote against it. But it then gets referred to the county manager. It never becomes O'Duffy Terrace. The Argus took it so seriously, they actually wrote an editorial about it. Keep politics out of it. Not to be called this, and it says at the bottom there, for heaven's sake, let the representatives of all points of view agree on what it should be called. So the controversy has gone on as to whether you're going to be O'Duffy Terrace. Name for the Blayney houses the next month. Council member attacked. Right? I think it's Jimmy Mooney who got attacked on the street by some of the other members, verbally assaulted them on the street. And then they were going to call it Marahi Crescent, right? To try and do everything. So this controversy goes on for about 6 months, and eventually they decide to abstain. When they've got a full meeting, they decide to abstain on calling it O'Duffy Terrace, and they've now got 5 voting against O'Duffy Terrace: Mickey Doherty, Ward, Johnny Murray, Eddie McElroy and J.J. Brennan, while the other 4 boys, the Finn Taylors, are still voting for it. And eventually it does go. And strangely enough, this is a remark here, they're talking about this, and Mr. Malone was saying that he was assaulted on the street, Benny Malone, and it did cause a certain amount of controversy, right? And then it comes to the minister to open the Blayney houses, and they were to be opened on the 13th of December 1949. Now, strangely enough, 4 months later, in May 1950, there's a reference to putting up a streetlight at the entrance to the Crescent, and it's just called the entrance to the Crescent. It's become the Crescent. I don't know where the decision came from. My assumption is the county manager made the decision himself, and it becomes the Crescent, and all the other Fatima Terraces and O'Duffy's Terraces all forgotten about, and within 5 months it's the Crescent. And it's stuck as the Crescent, more or less ever since, right? There was a major protest against the rent increases because they felt that, one, the rent was too high, and then increasing the rents as they were going up. And not that long after they had moved into it, there were protests, and they weren't going to pay the rents, and they were coming down to make protests outside the urban council meetings at the market house here. And they were refusing to pay their rent, and they were organising themselves. And the spokesperson was John MacDonald, national school teacher. That's Sean MacDonald, who lived down here. He lived in the house that is now P.J. Ward's, the single house at the other end of the Crescent. John MacDonald lived there, and he was their spokesman when they went to meet the council in relation to, right? And there's cries here of "do not pay" and so on and so forth. So they were certainly getting hot-headed. Eventually, this settles down, and they had a ballot, right? This was eventually how it all finished up. This is 1964. This was an attempt to change the name of the Crescent. After the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Mrs. Clifford, Brendan Clifford's wife, decided that she would organise a petition around the Crescent to change the name to John F. Kennedy Terrace in honour of the dead president. And she went to the council, and there's a whole furore, and eventually, again after a number of rows at the council meetings, they would have a referendum as to see should they change the name to the Crescent. So they went around the 71 tenants, and you see at the end there that only 10 signed in favour of the change to Kennedy Terrace, 45 voted against, and 15 or 16 abstained. So the decision was there would be no change to the name, so it didn't change to Kennedy Terrace. It remained the Crescent, as it has today. The one in the middle there is just a little piece which came in county manager's orders, but it was the county manager who made a lot of the decisions rather than the urban council. And a wee note appears in the middle, which you just may be interested in, that Harry J. McQuillan, Main Street, was allocated the tenancy of number 34. Harry McQuillan was not an original. He came in a couple of years after the others. Now, so one of the most interesting ones, sorry, I've lost it there. So amidst all the controversy, eventually the 71 houses are allocated, and the 71 houses are voted on, and between O'Duffy Terrace and Fatima Terraces and Kennedy Terraces and all the different sorts of names, 46 of the 71, which is a good percentage, it is the Crescent, and it remains the Crescent. welcome you all here this morning. Our broadcast live.